Okay, we're looking at the book of Revelation. Let's go to chapter 18 and verse 1. Revelation chapter 18 and verse 1. So last time we read chapter 17, and this time we're looking at chapter 18, but we're still looking at this thing called Babylon. So chapter 18, let's just read the first 3 verses of chapter 18. After this I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling for demons and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." So if you remember last time, in chapter 17, we looked at the woman riding the beast, Mystery Babylon, the end-time church, the false religious system, described as a woman, and we looked at that last time, and the whole of chapter 17 was describing the aspects of this false church system, this false religion, whatever that is. I think it's a combination of things, but it certainly includes a false Christian church. You can't commit adultery unless you do claim to have a husband. And this false church will claim to belong to Christ, but will actually belong to the beast and the kings of the earth who commit adultery with her. And so we looked at aspects of the religious side of this last time. But if you remember, we said this Babylon system is not just a religious system, it's also a nation, a city, a system of mankind. So there's 2 aspects to it. Chapter 17 is primarily, I think, the religious aspect, the woman. Chapter 18 is more about this system of government, this world empire, this city, this nation, this union of nations, or whatever it is going to be. It's not as clear as that. They overlap. Sometimes it's talking about the religious system, sometimes it's talking about the governmental system. There's a big overlap, and sometimes it's debatable which side of it the Bible's talking about. But it's all called Babylon. It's referred to as Babylon the Great, the great harlot, the great prostitute that sits over the nations of the world. It's the culmination of all these things that are summed up in the word Babylon. Now, the book of Revelation, 11% of the entire book is about Babylon. After Jerusalem, Babylon is the city that's talked about most in the Bible. Massive amounts. In fact, if you just sat down and just read the bits of the Bible that were about Babylon, you'd be there a long time. It's probably more than you read in a week. Just general Bible reading, just reading about Babylon. So we're talking about a massive amount of information about this thing that is called Babylon. Now, we've spoke about Babylon as we've been doing this study of Revelation. We've talked about it an awful lot. But what is it? Why have we now got another entire chapter, the whole of chapter 18? We've just had the whole of chapter 17 talking about Babylon. We've had it in previous chapters as well, a lot of information. Now we've got another entire chapter about Babylon. Do you think God thinks us knowing about Babylon is pretty important? Well, it must be, because God keeps emphasizing it again and again and again. So we've now got an entire chapter on Babylon the Great. And God emphasizes it to such a degree, he must want us to grasp it. Why does he want us to grasp it? Here's why I think he wants you to grasp it. You're in Babylon. We live in Babylon. Remember what Babylon is? Man's system of running the world through his governments, his economics, his education, his politics, his religion. Everything is Babylon. Why is it called Babylon? Because that's where mankind started building his own empire, in Babylon. And what something is at the beginning in the Bible is what God usually refers to it as. Yeah? The seed of the serpent, where did that start? In the garden. But the seed of the serpent's going to come in Revelation. Babylon started after the flood with Nimrod building his empire. So the final empire is, God still calls it Babylon, but Babylon the Great, because it's the ultimate climax of what Babylon is. So we looked at the religious system. Now let's try and look at the governmental system, the nation, the system of control that man uses to enslave God's people. Both are going to be destroyed. But the woman, Babylon the Great, the mystery Babylon, is going to be destroyed by the beast, by the government of Babylon. Right? God doesn't destroy the woman. The world does. This second aspect of Babylon, God's going to destroy it. God is going to destroy Babylon. God has always put an end to Babylon. You remember what happened at the beginning in Genesis when man said, we'll build our own name, our own city, our own tower, our own system without God. God came down and said, I don't think you will. I'll put an end to it. God will never allow mankind to build heaven. It would actually be hell, not heaven anyway, but God will not allow it. He will have to put a stop to it, and it will be destroyed. Okay? So we've got these introductory aspects here to what we've already said. Now, I'll not read the whole chapter to start with. We'll take it in portions. One thing that's important to mention, if you just go to verse 10 of chapter 18, 3 times throughout this chapter, you'll find this statement: terrified at her torment, people will stand afar off and cry, woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour your doom has come. If you just jump to verse 16, and the verse we've already looked at, just jump to verse 16, you find it again. Cry out, woe, woe to you, great city. 3 times God says, woe, woe. When God says woe, it's serious. When God says woe, woe, it's very serious. You remember Jesus would turn around to cities and say, woe to you. Those cities that he said woe to don't exist. If God says woe, woe 3 times in 1 chapter, Babylon is doomed. Man's system is doomed. Politics without God is doomed. Economics without God is doomed. An education system without God is doomed. A health system without God is doomed. It is all doomed. God cannot make it any clearer. You remove God from any aspect of society, that aspect has a curse over it and will come to nothing. It will collapse and be destroyed. So it's important for us to just be clear about that as anything else. Don't put your hope in politics without God. Don't put your hope in your education without God. Don't put your hope in anything without God. It's woed. Woe, woe, it's doomed. So, what is Babylon? The first attempt at man to build his own system of world government, because that's what it was originally. Now, Babylon was a real place. Can you put up that first slide, please, Ethan? So, Babylon was one of the wonders of the world. Even by historians like Herodotus, they said how amazing it was. I don't know if any of you have ever watched that, is it an Oliver Stone film called Alexander? Has anyone seen that film? It's not a very good film. It stars Colin Farrell. Yeah, Colin Farrell as Alexander the Great. It's just not right, is it? Charlton Heston, I could get that, but Colin Farrell, no. Well, it's not a very good film. I don't think it's a good film, but one part of it that is really good is where they come into Babylon, and the entire Greek army just can't take in how magnificent this city was. In fact, Alexander the Great built the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Guess where he said the center capital of his empire was going to be? Babylon. Because he says there's nothing like it. It just amazed everyone. One of the 7 wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Now, here's what it looked like. There's a picture of me at the British Museum with actually one of the lions at the entrance gates that they've taken from Babylon and put in the British Museum. They found lots of artifacts from ancient Babylon. And there in the bottom corner, that is what it looks like today. It's basically just an empty ruin now, but many of the walls are still there. Saddam Hussein actually was rebuilding it. In fact, if you look at that bottom left picture, can you see there's a hill in the background with a big building on the top? That's one of Saddam Hussein's palaces he built for himself. He wanted to style himself as the next king of Babylon. So that was the city. But what Babylon is most famous for is its tower. Yeah? The Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babylon. Now, it's amazing how many people, even today, think this is just a biblical myth, which is totally absurd. If you go to the next slide, Ethan, they've actually, this they deciphered fairly recently, actually. This is a tablet that they took from Babylon. And on the left, that's an actual photograph of the tablet. On the right, they've highlighted the markings on the tablet, and they've actually translated the Babylonian cuneiform, that Ugaritic script that they used in Mesopotamia. A lot of people can actually translate that fairly accurately. And it describes the building of a huge tower in Babylon, and the picture of the person there is the king of Babylon. So there's lots of archaeological documentary evidence to prove that there was indeed a huge tower, a massive tower. They've even got the dimensions on this tablet. There's nothing to do with the Bible. This is just scientific archaeology, proving that there was a tower there in Babylon. But even without that, if you go to the next slide, you can see it even today. If you go on Google Earth, that's actually a photo of Google Earth. So the top half of the picture is the city, the ruins of ancient Babylon, and just below it, you can see the foundations there of a massive tower. And I've zoomed in there, the arrow's pointing down towards it, and on the right-hand side, you can see those foundations. It's absolutely huge. Now, you can go on Google Earth, follow the Euphrates River down till you get to Babylon, zoom in, and you can look at that for yourself. There was a massive tower. The tower was the religious system. The city of Babylon was the governmental system. Okay, we looked at the religious system last time, so we're looking at the governmental system of man's rebellion against God this time. Okay, so what is Babylon? Well, that's how it started. Babylon cropped up throughout human history at several different points. And this system is also called the beast empire. We've read that throughout Revelation. If you go to Revelation chapter 12 and verse 3, Revelation 12 and verse 3, you remember when Satan is identified in Revelation chapter 12. Another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon, we know who he is, we've looked at that before, with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Now, we looked at what those were. The 10 horns are the 10 kingdoms that are going to come together at the final stage of human history. The 7 heads are 7 separate empires or kingdoms that Satan, because these are heads of Satan, these are heads on the dragon. So these are empires Satan is going to use, that God is going to show us his pattern throughout history, because these 7 heads, these 7 empires are the empires that affect Israel, that have controlled Israel, that have oppressed Israel. So if you go to the next chapter, chapter 13, verse 1, so Satan has got 7 heads, according to his system of running the world. When he creates his final government, in chapter 13, the dragon, that's Satan, stood on the sea, and I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads. So Satan is now transferring his power into a beast. The beast is the picture of man's kingdom, man's empire, but it's controlled by Satan, right? So it's the dragon with 10 heads. It's this kingdom of man that has, 7 heads. So if we've jumped to chapter 17, which is what we read last time, chapter 17 and verse 7, the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and the beast she rides, which has 7 heads, 10 horns." John is saying, what is all this? So the angel describes what the 7 heads are. Now, we've looked at this before, but I just want us to grasp it. It's not for a history lesson, so we understand where this world is heading. Okay? So what are the 7 heads? They're the 7 empires, because we're told that in Revelation. They're the 7 kings. And these are the empires that God has used throughout history to oppress the Jewish people, that Satan has used to control the world. So, can you put up that chart, please, Ethan? Just put it all up, the next chart. So, if we look at the biblical empires, now remember, there's been lots of empires in the world. You've had a Chinese empire, you've had a Japanese empire, you've had the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the empires of Central America and Latin America. Yeah, but they never affected Israel, and they're not in the Bible. We're talking about the empires that oppressed Israel, that controlled Jerusalem, that in some way affected the life of the Jews in a massive way. And according to the Bible, there's 7. These are the 7 empires. These are the 7 kingdoms. These are the 7 heads, right? But there's 2 ways of looking at it. I'll look at it one way, then I'll show you another way that the Bible talks about. So, when you read the Bible, the first nation that oppressed Israel was Egypt. Yeah? And each, remember, the head is also a king, the Revelation tells us. The king and the kingdom are synonymous. So I've given the Bible text there. We'll not look at those. So Egypt, the head was Pharaoh. Who did Pharaoh claim to be? God. The son of God. What did they do? Kill Jewish babies, enslave Israel, try and oppress them, try and wipe them out. First head, the empire that tried to control Egypt. I've put 1500 BC, obviously it went back way before that, but that's the time of Moses and the Israelites in Egypt. So next, after Egypt, when Israel went into its promised land, they were oppressed by the Assyrians. Now, they were oppressed by people like the Canaanites and the Philistines, but they were never world empires and they never controlled Israel. The Assyrians did. When the Assyrians came along, kings like Shalmaneser, Sennacherib, Sargon, lots of others, they actually took 10 of the 12 tribes into captivity, and the northern kingdom ceased to exist. It was controlled by the kings of Assyria. By the way, all these heads are pictures of Antichrist. So the Assyrians are very clearly one of the kingdoms that oppressed Israel. In fact, Antichrist, the one who comes at the final stage in the Old Testament, is actually often called the Assyrian. The Assyrian Empire would be Syria, Iraq of today, extending down into what is Babylon. So after Assyria, the Babylonians conquered Assyria. The most famous Babylonian head was Nebuchadnezzar, but there were others. And they most famously are the ones those Babylonians talked about in the Bible, because they destroyed the temple, destroyed Jerusalem, took the Jews into captivity for 70 years in 586 BC, and after 70 years they were allowed to come back home. Why were they allowed to come back home? Because when the 70 years were complete, literally to the very day, the Persian king Cyrus conquered the Babylonians in 539 BC, and the Persians took over and they sent all the Jews back. Well, actually, they told them they could go back if they wanted. Guess what? Most of them actually liked living in Babylon by that time. So actually, not many went back. Most of them stayed. There's a lesson there. Remember, most Christians actually like Babylon. They love it. Gives them what they want. So Cyrus sent them back. The Persian Empire lasted for a couple of hundred years after this, till they were conquered by the Greeks. Alexander the Great He also claimed to be God. By the way, all these kings claimed to be God, claimed to be the Son of God or the King of Kings. And he handed over to his generals, Antiochus, who tried to obliterate the Jews. Alexander wanted his empire. He actually died in Babylon, Alexander. Minted his coins in Babylon, wanted it to be his capital. And then Greece was conquered by the Romans, and the Romans obviously were controlled by the Caesars. The Caesars claimed to be God, deity. You had to worship Caesar by the middle of the 1st century AD. And so there you've got the empires, but then there's the final empire, which we've talked about in Revelation, which is a combination of all these. There's 7 heads. And Daniel's prophecies said the final one will be basically the others mixed together, sometimes called Rome Part 2. So can we see those are the 7 empires, with the 7 heads, with the 7 antichrists, with the 7 types of nations, empires, world systems that controlled the Jews. And the Roman Empire sort of never went away. It just split up into bits, and each bit has sort of established its own empire. Yeah? The British Empire came out of the Roman Empire, so did the French, so did the Spanish. You think of all Latin America, all the New World controlled by the Spanish and the British, the Portuguese, the French, the Belgians, the Dutch colonies. It's basically the Romans just spread out all over the world. So Babylon is alive and well. It's just morphed into different things. Its religion's still intact. Everything religiously, idol worship, it all comes out of Babylon. The ancient Sumerian culture, that's where Nimrod started everything. But there is another way of looking at it. Can you just go to the next slide, Ethan? So, another way of looking at this is to remember that actually it started in Babylon, this whole system. Right in the middle of the Bible, Babylon rose its head again after the Egyptians and the Assyrians. And then the final world empire, as we read in Revelation, is still called Babylon. So what does this mean? Well, if you go to Revelation 17 and verse 8, Revelation 17 and verse 8, when John is asking that, and he's just been told it's got 7 heads, the angel says this to him: the beast that you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. So he said, this beast, it once was, now it isn't, but it will come again. Babylon was the start, was the middle, and is the end. Right? It's all Babylon. So that would have made sense to John. Right? It once was. Well, what was the first world empire? The one that once was, Babylon. It now isn't. In the time of John, Babylon wasn't a world empire. But it will be again. So we've got a clue there that there's 3 stages to Babylon: beginning, middle, and end. Past, present, future. Then the angel says to John, the inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see this beast. Babylon's come back. Because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. Mentions that again so that we understand it. This calls for a mind of wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. Let's just keep going down to verse 12. There are also 7 kings. Each of these 7 empires had 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is. The other has not yet come. But when he does, he must remain only for a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king, and he belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. Okay, now that's a bit of a mouthful, but if we just put up that chart again, please, we can see that the 8th is also one of the 7. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other one's yet to come. So now can you see that makes perfect sense when you look at all these empires? There's actually 8, but the final Babylon is one of the 7. 1 once was, now is not, but is yet to come. So it's Babylon. It's this system of world control. So what does that mean? Everything that we saw in Babylon, from Nimrod at the beginning to Nebuchadnezzar in the middle to this final world empire, it is going to be modeled on Babylon. It's going to have one ruler, it's going to have one religious system, it's going to have one world currency, one education system. It's going to be all one entity that you have to obey. You have to belong to it. It's the way the dragon controls the beast. It's the way the beast controls the heads. It's the way the head controls the false prophet, so that everything is subject to this satanic dictatorship, one final world order that man is establishing. This is what we mean by Babylon the Great. So that's who they were, the heads, the time frame. Notice that Babylon was bang at the beginning, bang in the middle, and it's going to be right at the end. Now, what's interesting is, if that's true, that we've just read, when was the original Babylon? 2000 BC. It came back in the middle. So if that is perfectly balanced chronologically, and I'm not saying it has to be, when does it come back? Now. 2,000 years after Christ. Yeah? So in other words, our generation, I'm not setting a date, it could be 100 years away for all I know, I don't know. But what I'm saying is, chronologically, if you're looking at that, once was, now is not, but is yet to come, and what John's been said, if that's chronologically balanced in the same way that it's theologically balanced, then we are entering the final Babylon now. Man's system of world government. Now, when you think of how currency is now all done on a world trade system, if you think how economics, if you think how one world government is working, if you think how everything's coming together through the United Nations, if you think of how all this is coming together, we can see it. It's happening right now. This final Babylon system, as displayed there in that chart. Okay, so what does all this mean? Well, if you go to the next chart, please. So, not only is Babylon a system of world government, we're also told it is a city. It's a real place. Now, some people think the final Babylon will actually be in southern Iraq, in the original place of the original Babylon. I don't think that needs to be the case at all. Because the original Babylon wasn't just in Babylon. The original Babylon was the whole world. You remember in Genesis 11, when Babylon was originally built, it says, now the whole world had one language. The whole world had one leader. So originally Babylon was the whole world. And then in Genesis 11, God scattered them throughout the world. And so, whereas they'd built a Tower of Babel in Babylon, when they scattered all over the world, you'll notice everywhere in the world they built pyramids. Right, even in Latin America, even in Central America, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Egypt, the famous ones, but they're not even the biggest. There's much bigger ones in America. The Incas and Aztecs and Mayans are all built pyramids. They built them in India, in China as well. Why did they do that? Because when God scattered people all over the world, they still took the same systems with them. They might now be speaking different languages and use different names, but they still have a similar religious system of attaining heaven by your own works. They still have the ability to build their own empires. They're still copying Babylon, whichever nation you go to in the world, because all the nations of the world started in Babylon. So Nimrod was the first one. He built Babylon, Babel, the tower. What happened? God scattered them. Right, in Egypt, there were quite a few different capital cities in Egypt because of the empire was so long. Ramesses is a famous city, Tanis, Avaris, different ones. They were all abandoned. The Assyrian Empire, Nineveh, the Bible talks a lot about Nineveh, especially in books like Nahum and Jonah, was sent to Nineveh. Nineveh was totally destroyed. In fact, when Alexander the Great's army invaded and went across the Assyrian Empire into Babylon, they walked over Nineveh and didn't even know it was there. And in the time of Jonah, it was the biggest city in the world. Babylon is always destroyed. Now, Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylon that took the Jews into captivity, was never destroyed. And when you read the Bible and you read all these prophecies about Babylon being destroyed, remember one thing: it has not been fulfilled yet. Oh, it was destroyed by the Persians, Cyrus the Great and Darius, who took over Babylon. They didn't destroy it. They didn't destroy any of it. They took it actually by peaceful means. The army came and invaded. Most of the citizens of Babylon didn't even know they'd been invaded. In fact, they were quite happy to be taken over. When the Persians came, their capital city, Persepolis, that was burned to the ground by Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great came, the Greek Empire and the Seleucids, their capital cities were destroyed. Alexander built capital cities all over the world, and he tended to call them Alexandria after himself. The most famous one was Alexandria in Egypt, one of the wonders of the world. The Pharos Lighthouse was at Alexandria in Egypt. That was burnt to the ground. Big siege there by the Romans destroyed the Alexandria Library was destroyed. The Roman cities, Rome, Constantinople, they were both sacked. But if you look at number 4, Babylon was never destroyed. It was taken over by the Persians. The Greeks lived there and wanted to make it their capital. It still existed during Roman times, was never destroyed. And even into the 4th century AD, Babylon was still a center. Massive Jewish community lived in Babylon, still a big city. It was just sort of left. So why are we looking at that? Because there are so many prophecies in the Bible about Babylon's utter destruction. Not in Revelation, all the way through the Old Testament. And when I say there are lots of prophecies, I mean lots of prophecies. I mean entire chapters written by prophets. Jeremiah writes 2 whole chapters, chapters 50 and 51, just about the prophecies of Babylon's destruction. Isaiah writes 2 whole chapters. He actually writes a lot more than that, but 2 whole chapters, Isaiah chapter 13 and 14, just about Babylon's destruction. Other prophets write about it. So what? It's never happened. They are all prophecies. But when you read the Old Testament, you can read all this stuff and think, oh, that's all been fulfilled. It hasn't. Babylon was never destroyed in that way. It's the final Babylon that's going to be destroyed. It's the world empire that's coming now that's going to be destroyed. That's the one that God's going to say is utterly doomed. Now, what is it based around? We know it's a world empire. Where is its headquarters? What is its capital city? Well, theologians argue about this. Some people think it literally has to be Babylon. If it is, I think that has to be a long way away because there's hardly anyone who lives there now. Some people think it's Rome. Some people think it's Mecca. Some people think it's London. Some people think it's New York. Some people think it's Jerusalem. Some people think it's Royston. No one thinks it's Royston. There's all kinds of... I don't think it matters because Babylon is the whole world. Yeah? It was in the beginning. When it was the empire, it controlled the known world at that time. It's the whole world. Where its capital city is, it's still Babylon. Whether it's Rome, whether it's Mecca, whether it's Babylon, it has to be a very influential city religiously as well as politically. We've already looked at that. So, if we just go to the next slide. So, if you remember, Daniel gave the same prophecies. Exactly the same prophecies. But Daniel gave them in the vision of a statue. Now, in Daniel's time, remember, Daniel lived in Babylon. In 586, when the temple was destroyed, Daniel was already living in Babylon. He'd been taken captive before that. So the Egyptian and Assyrian empires had already passed away. So Daniel was looking ahead, and he saw 4 more empires to come, and he saw the statue of the gold, silver, bronze, and iron. And then he had another vision in Daniel chapter 2, and then one in chapter 7 of 4 different kinds of beast. And then he sees the final empire coming, which is a combination of all the others. The terrifying beast, the one that has claws and iron, and this combination of iron mixed with clay, 10 toes. There we've got the 10 heads again, the 10 horns, the 10 crowns. It's the 10 nations at the end of time that come together to form this empire. That's why when the Treaty of Rome was signed, that formed the European Union, because there was originally 10 nations, a lot of theologians said, this is it, the final world empire is Europe. It's based on Rome, it's based on the Treaty of Rome, it's called Europa, who was the woman who rides the beast, and it's started by 10 nations. This has got to be it. Some people still think that, and there is a lot of evidence for that, but I think it's going to be much bigger than that personally. So that's how Daniel saw it. He described it in a different way because he lived at a different period. He saw 4 nations coming. Not 7, because the others had passed away. He was looking into the future, not into the past. But it's still the same thing that he's seeing. Still the same nations. Exactly the same nations. Daniel even names them. The empires that are coming. So, after Rome, there's the gap, which is the church age there. And then there's the final empire that is yet to come. That had never really gone away, but is going to assert itself in the final era. Okay? So, are you still with me? What's that got to do with us? That's an interesting history lesson. That's interesting theologically. Yeah, but here's what it has to do with us. We're in Babylon. What are you going to do about it? Because what we've just read, or what we're going to read in Revelation chapter 18, God describes very clearly what's going to happen to Babylon, what's going to happen to its systems, what God has predestined, what God has planned for Babylon, and depending on your relationship with Babylon depends on how that's going to affect you. Because if you're addicted to Babylon, then you're going to suffer in the same way that Babylon does. So it's very important that we try and grasp this. Now, let's go back to Revelation 18 then. Revelation chapter 18, and we read up to verse 3, so let's start reading at verse 4. So we've already read the mighty angel coming down, saying that Babylon is doomed. Revelation chapter 18 and verse 4, then I heard another voice from heaven say, come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues, for her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she has given, pay her back double for what she has done, pour her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, I sit enthroned as a queen, I am not a widow, I will never mourn. Therefore, in one day her plagues will overtake her. Death, mourning, and famine, she will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord who judges her. When the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. One more verse. Terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour your doom has come. So, we've just got a concise description there of what God is saying about Babylon. So, I've just put a little chart together for us to look at some of these aspects so that we can apply them to ourselves and think, what is our attitude to Babylon? Do we agree with God? Next slide, please. So, first thing we need to understand. So on the right there, we've got what we've just read there in Revelation, right up to verse 10. First thing to understand, John, when he's writing Revelation, what the angel is showing him and what he's seeing is actually a repetition of what the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah have already said. This is not new material. If you've read Isaiah, especially chapter 13 and 14, if you've read Jeremiah, especially chapter 50 and 51, everything you read there in chapters of Revelation 17 and 18 is a repeat of what the other prophets had said. Literally word for word, a lot of it. There's nothing new. It was prophesied thousands of years ago. Not just when John said it, it was prophesied 1,000 years even before John said it. Babylon's doom was written down. It was actually decided by God way back in the beginning when Nimrod built Babylon. God has always said, you're not doing that. I'm going to destroy it. The problem I have in trying to teach this is to teach those 10 verses we've read. I have to teach you the whole of Isaiah, the whole of Jeremiah, most of Ezekiel, all of Daniel, a lot of Zechariah, and what half a dozen other prophets have said as well. So I'm trying to convey truths to you, hoping you've already read all that other stuff. Now, I know even if you have, you probably can't recall it all right now. So, I've just put some key phrases to try and link us with what John's saying so we can get some key concepts of what our attitude to Babylon should be, because the Bible is so clear about this. I mean, you'd have to be a bit thick to get it wrong. First thing, the obvious one that we've already read there and is repeated in Revelation 18. Babylon is going to fall. If you are in any doubt about that, you are deceived and deluded. If you think the politicians of the world are the answer, you need prayer. It's going to fall. If you think man's system of unity through its economics and trade and education and philosophy, if you think that's the answer, well, God bless you, but it's all doomed. There is nothing more certain. And I've given two key examples there, Isaiah and Jeremiah. Can we just go there? Isaiah 21 verse 9. Isaiah 21 verse 9. Look, here comes a man in a chariot. This is Isaiah prophesying about Babylon with a team of horses, and he gives back the answer. Babylon has fallen, has fallen. All the images of its gods lie shattered on the ground. What we just read in Revelation is repeating what Isaiah saw. Babylon is fallen, is fallen. When God says something twice, remember he's saying it's unchangeable. You remember Pharaoh's dreams? When he had the dream twice, Joseph says, because God showed it you twice, it means it's definitely going to happen. That 7 years is definitely going to happen because God showed it you twice, which means it's not going to change. Right? It's doomed. Let's just get that. All its images of its gods lie shattered to the ground. All its philosophies, everything it hopes in, everything mankind thinks will help it, it will not. Only God will build a kingdom that is an everlasting kingdom. Only God will build a kingdom that will last forever. Remember what Daniel said, in the time of those kings, the final Babylon, God will set up a kingdom that is an eternal kingdom, the kingdom of Jesus Christ. Okay, so go back to the chart then, please. So Jeremiah says the same thing. We'll not turn there. He talks the same about Babylon is going to fall because of everything it's slain. Interestingly, when Isaiah prophesies the fall of Babylon in chapter 13 and 14, he actually, when he's talking about the king of Babylon in chapter 14, Isaiah suddenly switches emphasis. And instead of just saying how Babylon is fallen, he says, how art thou fallen, O Lucifer? And he actually doesn't, but who's he actually talking about if you read the prophecy? The king of Babylon. And then he switches it and starts talking about the fallen angel, the fallen cherub who is cast out of heaven. So Isaiah equated the king of Babylon with the devil, with Satan himself, the fallen angel. That's there in Isaiah chapter 14, where he describes that. But it's the same words, fallen, fallen. You're coming down. God is not going to change his mind. He's not going to let you off. God's not going to prop up your political party, whichever one that is. God's got a political party. It's called the Kingdom of Heaven. And you don't vote for it, but it's going to get in. Okay, what else did we read in Revelation? We read there in Revelation 18 and verse 4, come out of her, my people. What did Isaiah say? Let's go to what Isaiah said about Babylon. Isaiah 48 and verse 20. Leave Babylon. Flee from the Babylonians. Announce this with shouts of joy and proclaim it. Send it out to the ends of the earth. Say, the Lord has redeemed his people. What did Jeremiah say about it? Let's go to Jeremiah chapter 50 and verse 8. Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 8. So John in Revelation hears the angel, hears the voice, get out. Isaiah said, get out. What does Jeremiah say? Flee out of Babylon. Now, let's just stop here. Had the Jews gone into captivity in Babylon in Isaiah's time? No. Had they gone into captivity when Jeremiah was prophesying? No. They were going to in his time, but they hadn't. So they're not talking about something that was already happening. They were talking about something in the future. The Babylonians weren't even the world power in the time of Isaiah. It was the Assyrians. Isaiah didn't say, flee the Assyrians. He said, flee Babylon. Well, Babylon wasn't in control. There was no Jews in Babylon. So they're not talking about just something practically to do in their time. They're prophesying this future event. They're prophesying about us. The end time Babylon. Because it hadn't happened when they were saying this. I will stir up and bring against Babylon the alliance of great nations. All the nations of the world are going to be involved in the final Babylon. That had not happened in their time. They weren't talking about something they were experiencing. They were talking about the end time Babylon. Flee, get out, leave my people, get out of Babylon. When? Now. Get out. But I'm not in Babylon. We're all in Babylon. We're controlled by it. It governs us. Man's systems are telling us what you can think, what you can say, what words you can use, what economics you will. You try and survive without adopting the economic system of this world. You can't do it. The education system will teach your kids what we decide they're going to be taught. You don't have a say in it. It's Babylon. We'll tell you what religion's acceptable. You won't tell Babylon what to do. What does God say? Get out. Because you're coming out. God's not leaving his people in Babylon. But he's not going to drag them out if they like it. Most of the Jews, when they did get taken into Babylon, most of them stayed there. Even when they could go home, they didn't want to anymore. They got comfortable in the world. That's why in the New Testament, get out of the world. Don't be friends of this world. Don't start enjoying this world. It's all coming down. And Jeremiah there is prophesying. Remember, he'd said you're going into captivity to Babylon for 70 years. But when the time is complete, leave Babylon. And so when Daniel, Jeremiah was now dead, when Daniel was in Babylon, when the 70 years were completed, what did Daniel do? Prayed for all the Jews to get out and get back home. And when he prayed for all the Jews to leave Babylon, the angel came to him, and what did the angel say to Daniel? There's another 70 coming. There's another 70 weeks coming. And that's when the final Babylon's going to come. That's when the great leaving of Babylon's going to happen. The angel said, seal up the vision, it's for a time in the future. Yeah, but it's not in the future for us, it's now. We're at the end of that process. The weeks have completed. The days are fulfilled. The 6,000 years is over. The 7th millennium is here. What do? You get ready to leave. We're not called to Babylon. We're called to Jerusalem, the kingdom of heaven. Okay, let's go back to the chart. So, it's going to fall. We've got to leave. Now, one of the things that's emphasized perhaps more than everything else about Babylon is something called pride. Satan himself, in the descriptions of his fall, it's all about his pride. It's called the overweening pride of the Babylonians. The Babylonians thought they were invincible, and they were for a time. But when the king became proud, Daniel gave him that prophecy. You know, he was drinking the cups out of the temple, saying, we've conquered the God of Israel. What have we seen in Babylon in Revelation? Drinking the cup. And God wrote on the wall, many, many take all who pass in. You have been found in the balance. You have been wearing the balance and found lacking. Tonight, it's all over. Babylon falls. And so the pride comes to an end. Now, Isaiah repeats this. Jeremiah repeats this. We'll not turn to them, but they talk about it an awful lot, about how Babylon is just full of pride. The politicians, the rulers, the philosophers, they think they are so right. They think they can do it all without God. You can't even talk to them. They just mock you. You're a fool for believing in God. You're a fool for sticking to the Bible. You're a fool. You're stupid. You're an imbecile. You've got a deficient IQ. No, it's got nothing to do with intelligence, actually. You're full of pride and you don't even know it. You're lifted up with pride. In fact, some people even boast of their own pride. It's as if pride is a symbol of pride, which is one of the most absurd conclusions you could think of. Look at Isaiah 13, verse 19. Isaiah 13 and verse 19. You see, mankind is so stupid. Not only will he deny he has pride, he'll think pride is a good thing. Babylon, the jewel of the kingdoms, the pride and the glory of the Babylonians will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. God links pride with Sodom. And that's very interesting, because today people link those two together as well and boast in it. Boast in the very thing that God says is going to bring destruction. We'll come on to Sodom in a minute. So let's go back to the chart. So, pride. You know you're in Babylon because people are not just doing things, they're actually proud of it. Babylon, in Revelation, as we've already seen, is seen as the woman. She's seen as the woman. She boasts, I sit as queen, I will never be a widow. She boasts as the woman. She is a woman. She's Satan's harlot. She's not the bride of Christ. But Isaiah and Jeremiah said exactly the same thing. So did Zechariah, if you remember. We looked last time. Zechariah saw the woman in a basket. And he says, what is this? And the voice said, this is wickedness. It's been taken to Babylon to be set in its place for the final time. Okay, just go to the one in Isaiah. We'll not look at Jeremiah. Isaiah 47, verse 7. Remember what we've just read in Revelation. She sits as queen, says, I will never be a widow. What did Isaiah say? You said, I am forever the eternal queen. But you did not consider these things or reflect on what might happen. Now then, listen, you lover of pleasure. If there's anything that describes Babylon, it's the pursuit of pleasure. They live for what makes them happy instead of honor and duty and what is right. You lover of pleasure, lounging in your security and saying to yourself, I am and there is none besides me. I will never be a widow. You see, Revelation says exactly the same thing, word for word. Sitting as queen, never be a widow or suffer the loss of children. Why does Babylon say, I will never be a widow? Because, especially if you've read my book, whenever God picks a woman to use, he picks a widow. The genealogy of Jesus Christ, Bathsheba, widow. Tamar, widow. Why does God pick widows? Ruth, widow. Yeah? When Jesus was looking to give examples, he always looked for a widow. See the widow? The widow who prays, she will be heard. The widow who gives, she will be rewarded. When his mother would become a widow. David's wives, Bathsheba, widow, Abigail, widow. Why is it that the women that God picks, they know they're widows? They understand they're widows. They understand that they belong to this world system and that system's dead to them. They're a widow to this world. They want nothing to do with this world. I want nothing to do with Babylon. I'm a widow to Babylon. Babylon says, I'll never be a widow. I am and there's none like me. I'll never suffer. But a true Christian knows that they're widowed. That's what Romans 6, 7, and 8 is all about. Do you not know that a woman is bound to her husband as long as her husband lives? But if her husband's died, she becomes a widow. Yes, but she's free from the tyranny of her husband. She's free from the law. She's free from sin. She can now marry someone else. She can now become the bride of Christ. So the church knows we were widows, but Babylon doesn't accept that. Babylon boasts. Jeremiah says a similar thing. Okay, back to the chart then. So, Babylon is a woman. Babylon is doomed, which might sound strange. That might sound pretty obvious. But it's amazing how many people don't actually study the prophecies of all the nations in the Bible. You see, there's so much information, we tend to gloss over it. There's different prophecies for every different nation. I'm sure you're pretty much aware of that. You know, Egypt has one prophecy. You know, Syria has a prophecy. Lebanon, all these nations have prophecies. Babylon's prophecy is, you're totally doomed, it's over. But it's never happened. So it has to be still yet to come. Assyria was destroyed. Nineveh was gone. I mean, totally obliterated. Persepolis was burned to the ground by Alexander's army. Rome was sacked. Constantinople was sacked. Babylon wasn't. So all these prophecies have still yet to be fulfilled, because none of them fit Revelation, Jeremiah, or Isaiah. They don't fit the original Babylon. So it must be the future Babylon. So all this is still going to happen. In 1 hour, it's going to go. The whole system is just going to go like that. In 1 hour, everything's going to come to an end. God's going to bring it all to an end. There's lots of prophecy. There's a prophecy in Isaiah. It's called the burden of Damascus. And Isaiah prophesies that Damascus is going to be so obliterated, no one's ever going to live there. Do you know Damascus is the single longest inhabited, continuously inhabited city in the whole world? That prophecy has never been fulfilled. Damascus is the capital of Syria. It's been bombed to bits this past few years. Isaiah says it's going to go. Now, it's never happened in history, so it's still yet to be fulfilled. There's a prophecy about Elam. There's a prophecy about a place called Elam that's going to be so devastated no one can live there for some sort of contamination issue. Does anyone know where Elam is? It's in the news tonight. It's the southern part of Iran where their nuclear reactor is being built. Now, I'm not a military strategist, but I believe the Israeli Air Force, when they say if they are going to build nuclear weapons, we're going to take them out. And if they bomb that nuclear facility, no one's going to be able to live there. That prophecy has not been fulfilled in that way. Now, when could that happen? That could happen tomorrow. I'm sure you've seen the news today. Iran have seized British oil tankers. So they're mobilizing military where? What is the first place they're going to hit? The nuclear facility in Elam. Now, I'm not saying that is necessarily the fulfillment of that prophecy. What I'm saying is these prophecies that have yet to be fulfilled, we can see Damascus being destroyed and no one living there. You know, if Hezbollah or the Iranian terrorists take over Syria and start bombing Israel from Damascus, Israel will just whack them. They won't let Tel Aviv get hit. They'll hit Damascus. They'll hit Elam. And the Bible seems to indicate it's Israel that does it, in some of these prophecies at least. There's another prophecy. This is an interesting prophecy. Daniel 11, verse 40. Let's just go there. This is an interesting one. There's a prophecy in the Bible about 3 nations that Antichrist doesn't get control over. 3 nations that Antichrist can't invade. So here's Daniel prophesying about Antichrist. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle. The king of the north, the Antichrist, will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He'll bring this enormous army against in this battle. He will invade many countries. He will sweep through them like a flood. Daniel's prophesying about the Antichrist. He will also invade the beautiful land. He'll invade Israel. So this has got to be the end time. Many countries will fall. But Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. So Daniel says, when this happens, these three nations he won't invade. Antichrist will not touch these three nations for some reason. Doesn't explain why. Now, does anyone know where Edom, Moab, and Ammon are? Today, they're not three nations. They're one nation. It's called Jordan. Jordan is Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Those three nations are now geographically the nation of Jordan. What did Jesus say? When you see the armies come, flee to Jordan. Why? Because Antichrist's not going to go there. That's actually what they did in AD 70. The Christians, when the Romans came, they fled to Jordan. They fled to Edom, Moab, and Ammon because they remembered what Jesus said. So even at the time of the end, for the Jews who believe in Jesus, there will be a place to escape to. Flee to the mountains. And Jesus told them to do that. Why? Because he knows Antichrist, for some reason, can't touch that geographic area. Now, in the time of that prophecy, that were three separate nations. How can you flee to three separate nations? Which one? But today, that's only one nation. And if you know your Middle East politics, Jordan is very different than the rest of the nations. They're getting very, very friendly with Israel. You can travel from Israel into Jordan now without any hassle. So let's go back to the chart then. That was just a diversion. Sorry about that. I just want us to see that these things, they're not just abstract prophecies. They relate to current world events that are being fulfilled right now. Even this week, many of these could possibly, we could see them right on the horizon happening at any time. Now, the final link that we've already seen in Revelation, that Isaiah and Jeremiah state, is that Babylon is called Sodom, emphatically. So we've already just seen that in Isaiah 13 and verse 19. Go to where Jeremiah's talking about Babylon, verse 50 and verse 40. Chapter 50 and verse 40, Jeremiah 50. Verse 40. So Jeremiah, when he's talking about Babylon, he says exactly the same thing. Jeremiah and Isaiah didn't know each other. So when he's going to overthrow Babylon, he says, as I overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah along with their neighboring towns, declares the Lord, so no one will live there. No people will dwell in it. So the prophets, when they said what Babylon is going to be like, they says, oh, it's going to be like Sodom. So, what was Sodom like? If we need to know what Babylon's like, what was Sodom like? Well, let's put up the next chart then. So, I'm sure you know the story of Sodom. I'm sure we don't have to read the whole story in Genesis chapter 19. Let's just look at just a few verses just to get the flavor. Let's go to Genesis 19 and verse 4. Genesis 19 and verse 4. So the angels came down to Sodom to investigate what was happening in Sodom, and they came into Lot's house. Lot was the only person, the only righteous person in Sodom, Lot and his two daughters and his wife, and they invited the angels into the house. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind them and said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have two daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like to them, but don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." "Get out of our way," they replied. "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." They kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. But the men inside reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. We'll stop there. We'll not read the whole story. Can we go back to the chart, please? So here's a situation in Sodom, which sort of epitomizes what was happening in Sodom at the time. So, what do we need to know about Sodom? Well, Jesus said that as in the days of the coming of the Son of Man, it will be just like Sodom. Society will have become just like Sodom. It will have reverted. Let's go to it. Luke 17, verse 28. Luke 17, verse 28. So here's Jesus talking about the end time, the final generation. It was the same in the days of Lot in Sodom. People were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But the day Lot left Sodom, fire and sulfur rained down from heaven and destroyed them all. It will be just like this, not it will be like this. It will be just like this on the day the Son of Man is revealed. Okay, let's go back to the chart. So, what was Sodom like? Well, Jesus said they were eating and drinking and getting on with life. Many aspects of Sodom were totally normal to everyday life. Living in Sodom was like living anywhere else. You could live in Sodom and get on with your life and eat and drink and have a job and bring up your kids just like you could at any other stage in human history. Jesus says they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage and lots of things just as the days of Noah. Jesus said the same thing. Everybody thought everything was carrying on as normal. Until the rapture. Until the angels came. Until they got Lot out. Then the wrath of God fell on them for everything they'd done. They weren't expecting it, though. They thought everything would carry on as normal. So what was the next thing that we could look at about Sodom? Well, in many ways it was normal. If we go down to the next thing on the chart, in many ways things that changed massively. The whole sexual identity and sexuality of Sodom had totally changed from what it had originally been. The concept of marriage didn't seem to exist anymore. Now, it still existed because Lot's daughters were getting married. But who were they marrying? Well, they seemed to be marrying men of Sodom. Well, they were marrying men of Sodom. But we've just read that it said all the men of Sodom were also engaged in other sexual activities that God had condemned. So who on earth were they marrying? They were marrying people who had a very strange view of sexual behavior, certainly didn't agree with what God thought about sexual behavior. You see, this is what happened to Sodom. Sodom just embraced any idea of sexuality. Well, anything goes. Well, whatever happens. Yeah, we still believe in your view of marriage, but you've got to accept our view of marriage. And if we want to do this, you've got to accept that. And if your daughters want to do this, they can, but they've got to accept this as well. And as it was in the days of Noah, let's just go there to Jude chapter 1 and verse 6. Here's how Jude describes the situation in Sodom. Jude 1 verse 6, or just Jude 6, there is no chapter 1. And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on that great day. Next verse. In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion to serve as an example of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire. So Jude says, it's like when the angels fell. The angels changed their natures. The men of Sodom changed their natures. Never in human history have we been on the brink of actually just deciding to change people's genders at a whim. Change people's very natures. Even with children. I think there's been something like a 4,000% increase in gender transition in the past year. I mean, I don't know the exact figures, but suddenly it's been decided we'll just change whatever the biological nature, whatever your chromosomes say, whatever the science says, we'll just decide we're going to change it. Well, that's what the fallen angels did. They just decided we're not going to be angels, we're going to take human women. In Sodom, they just decided, well, we're just going to change everything. We're just going to decide any sexual activity is acceptable because we say it is. And we're not having Lot telling us what to do. The whole nature of society just flipped. And it happened very quickly. Just became something totally different overnight. Go to the next one, 2 Peter 2, verse 6. So this is what the end time society is going to be like. It's going to be like Sodom. We've been told 3 times. It's actually mentioned many times in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. I'm just giving you New Testament examples here. It's mentioned even more in the Old Testament. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 6. If he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless. You see, one of the tests of whether you really want to get out of Babylon is, does all this stuff distress you? If it doesn't, then you're comfortable in Babylon. Lot was distressed. He didn't know what to do. How do I handle this? What are they doing to my kids? What are they doing to society? Why are they banging on the door, making me accept their views of all this behavior that God has said is wrong? Verse 8, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. If this is so, is that true? Yes. If this is so, then God knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. Lot was distressed. He didn't know what to do. They were banging on the door. They were telling him he had to accept their view of what they believed, even about sexual behavior, even in his own house. They were saying, you've got to do this. Your kids have got to do that. Lot's house was the church in Sodom because they washed feet and broke bread there. They were saying, you can't believe what you want. You're going to believe what we say. And he got to the end of his tether. What am I going to do? Well, he forgot who was in the house. The angels of God were there. They'd come down to find out if Sodom had actually become as wicked as everyone said it had. And it had. And so the angels said to Lot, we're getting you out of here. They didn't tell Lot to start a political party to try and reform Sodom. They didn't tell Lot at the next election, vote for a different mayor. They didn't tell him to go stand outside the school shouting at the gates that he didn't agree with their education policies. They didn't say any of those things. They said, we're getting you out, and we're getting you out tonight. Lot wasn't ready for that. Who was safe from Sodom? All the brides. All the brides in the church. And even one of those changed her mind because she actually liked living in Sodom. Don't underestimate the hold Babylon has over you. You can love its entertainments and its systems and its education just as much as any Babylonian. And the real test is when God comes to you and says, right, we're off. Are you coming? That's the real test. You remember the rich man? I'll follow you. I obey the commandment. Jesus says, right, give everything away. Come with me. You're like, oh, hold on a minute. But now, yes, now. Get ready. Are you ready to go now? Well, I've just got married. Well, I've just done that. Well, are you ready to go? The angels turned up, and Lot didn't even know they were angels. They says, we're going. I'm getting you out of here. God knows how to rescue the righteous. He doesn't reform Sodom. He destroys Sodom. He's not going to reform Babylon. Babylon is going to fall. Babylon is doomed. Babylon is going to be destroyed. But what he does is he gets the righteous out first. That's why when people say they don't believe in the rapture, I don't know what Bible they're reading. God always rescues the righteous before he brings the destruction. He did it with Noah. He did it with Enoch. He did it with Lot. He always gets them out. In fact, the angel said to Lot, we can't destroy this place until we've got you out. So he could have took his time, actually. I wouldn't have argued with an angel, but you know. Yeah? Next thing, you put up the chart. So he gets the righteous out through a rescue, through a rapture. Jesus promised the church, I will save you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole earth. I'm going to get you out before the wrath of God comes. The righteous are saved out of Sodom. One of them turned back. As a warning, Jesus said, remember Lot's wife. remember you might actually love Babylon more than the church. And sadly, many Christians turn back from following Christ because they love the world. Next one. Remember, I'll not go to the scriptures for this because we've already read it previously in Revelation. The persecution of Lot in Sodom was backed up by the legal government. It wasn't just a mob that was attacking Lot's house. The officials of Sodom were all in with it. They actually thought Lot was the bad guy for not letting them force their ideas onto him. And in the final generation, it's the church that's evil for not accepting all these different views, whether it's sexual behavior, whatever it is. People think the church is the bad. You're the bad guys. You're the bigots. You're the intolerant ones. You're the ones who won't accept us forcing our views on you. I mean, the absurdity of it all is ridiculous, but it's actually you're the one being intolerant. I'm not persecuting you. Why are you persecuting me? Why are you banging on my door? I'm not banging on your door. But it's a state-organized system. It's the legal power. It's the beast Babylon system. Christians will be killed as state policy. It will be law. Next one. So in Sodom, as we've already alluded to, really, the righteous leave before judgment comes. When did Lot leave? In the middle of the night. Because when dawn rose next day, the day of the Lord, the judgment came. But Lot was taken as a thief in the night. Jesus always says, behold, I come as a thief in the night. What does he do? He harpaizos us, that Greek word. It literally means to grab your hand violently and pull you out. What did the angels do to Lot? They grabbed him violently by the hands and pulled him out in the night. The people of Sodom didn't even know he'd gone. The only thing they knew was the judgment. Now, where is Sodom? Sodom is somewhere in the southern end of the Jordan Valley. There's massive deposits of sulfur there. There was sulfur fell from the sky. Any scientist who've looked at this can say, yes, there was some obliteration event that happened here. Sulfur fell from the sky, maybe through a tectonic plate shift, volcanic activity, but sulfur certainly fell from the sky and destroyed everything that was in that area. It's a very dead area, and that's where the Dead Sea is. Whether it was the northern end or the southern end or in the middle of the Dead Sea, people argue about, but it was in that area somewhere. So the world will be judged when the righteous leave. Next aspect of Sodom. When you read in Romans 9, especially verse 28 and 29, Paul says, and he's quoting the Old Testament here, he says, if God did not save the remnant of Israel, they would have been like Sodom. But he's talking about the salvation of Israel in the end times, because that's what chapter 9 of Romans is all about. So even when God brings this judgment on Babylon that we've seen in this massive extent in Revelation, the judgment of the whole world system, there is going to be still a salvation of the faithful Jews. They are not going to be like Sodom. Romans says that. God saves the remnant. Final one on this list, obviously Jesus said, remember Lot's wife. Go to Luke chapter 17 and verse 31. Luke chapter 17, verse 31. We read up to verse 30 and the first item on the list. On that day, no one who is on his housetop with possessions inside should go down to get them. Likewise, no one in the field should go back for anything. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever tries to keep their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life will preserve it. Let's just read a couple more verses. I tell you, on that night, 2 people will be in one bed. One will be taken, the other one left. 2 women will be grinding corn together. One will be taken and the other one left. Jesus says, when I come to take people away on that rescue, it will be just like it was in Sodom. Some will be taken, some will be left. The ones who were taken is the ones who were listening by faith. The Bible says Lot was a righteous man by faith. They're the ones that will be taken. Okay, so that's Sodom. Okay then, so let's go back to Revelation chapter 18. Revelation chapter 18, let's go to verse 11. Now I'm going to do the second half of the chapter very quickly. Because we could just be here forever, even just studying this next part. So, Revelation chapter 18, verse 11 to 20, actually lists the trade and merchandise of what Babylon is involved in, its economic system. Now, you might think, well, so what? Well, I'll show you so what why in a moment. But let's just read these next 10 chapters, and then I'll just give a summary of what I think God is showing us here. Okay, the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, Babylon, because no one buys their cargoes anymore. The economic system's failed. It runs on an economic system, trade system, Babylon. Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, fine linen, purple silk and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron and marble. Cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and human beings sold as slaves. They will say, the fruit you longed for is gone from you. All your luxury and splendor has vanished, never to be recovered. The merchants who sold these things and gained their wealth from her will stand afar off, terrified at her torment. They will weep and mourn and cry out, there's that phrase again, woe, woe to you, great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. In 1 hour, such great wealth has been brought to ruin. Every sea captain and all who travel by sea, the sailors and all who earn their living from the sea will stand afar off. When they see the smoke of her burning, they will exclaim, was there ever a city like this great city? Let's keep going down to verse 20. They will throw dust on their heads and with weeping and mourning cry out, there it is again, woe, woe to you, great city, where all who had ships on the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour she has been brought to ruin. Rejoice over her, you heavens. Rejoice, you people of God. Rejoice, apostles and prophets, for God has judged her with the judgment she imposed on you. So Babylon killed the apostles and the prophets and the people of God and those now in heaven. So he's using the same judgments on Babylon that Babylon has dished out on everyone else. Okay, so you will have noticed there that there was a whole list of items, right? Now, what are all those items? Now, because you come to this church, and I tell you stuff like this, you may have gathered there that all those items mean something. They're not just lists of obscure items. They're actually ingredients and merchandise of very specific things. There's 28 in total, but I've lumped some together to make it easier to look at. Can you put up the next chart as a whole, please, Ethan? So you will know, because you come to this church and we teach on stuff like this, that every single one of these items has a religious purpose. Yeah? Gold in the Bible means righteousness. Yeah? The righteousness, only gold. Only the righteous could enter God's presence. In the temple, everything was gold. Once you got into the holy place, the holy righteousness of God, represented by gold. Silver is a a picture of redemption, salvation. When you bought something to own it, you paid in silver. Jesus was sold for silver. Joseph was sold for silver. You paid silver. The redemption price for every person in Israel was silver. It represents salvation or redemption. Precious stones, well, the holy city is covered in precious stones. It means other things as well. The crystals, the sapphires, the rubies, all these precious stones on the high priest. It means belonging to God, something precious to God. So all of these things mean something. Pearls are the gates into heaven. We even use the phrase, don't we? The pearly gates, access into heaven. So what do all these things mean? Well, Babylon has all of these things, but they are counterfeits of the real thing. You see, that's what Babylon does. Babylon has gold. Babylon has its own righteousness. We don't have to obey God. We're righteous in our own right. Our humanistic philosophies say so. We don't need redemption. We've got our own silver. We don't need to be saved from anything. We're happy as we are. I saw someone walking on a big march through, I think it was London, maybe New York the other day, and they held up a placard saying, "Going to hell, I'm proud of it." It's like, what on earth? You don't think you need saving. That's what Babylon does. You don't need saving. You're not guilty. You've got no sin. It's just an invented religious concept. There is no God. There is no judgment. The pearls, gates into heaven. You can get into heaven any way you want. You don't have to go. We've got our own pearls. There's many ways to God. Get into heaven anyway. Well, Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." The linen, the fine linen, well, that's what the priests wore. You couldn't be a priest unless you were dressed in linen. Well, we can just appoint our own priests. You can worship any way you want. The purple, the king, the royalty, everyone's accepted by God. Well, they are if they repent and turn to God, but God can't give everything he has to unless you really belong to him. And so all these items have a religious connotation in some way. The cloth there, that's what they used to build the tabernacle, the various woods, that's the precious woods they used to build the temple. The ivory was a picture of the palace of God. It even says that in the Psalms, he is the one from the palaces adorned with ivory. Bronze was a picture of the altar. The iron is a picture of strength. Babylon thinks it's strong without God. We don't need God, we have our own strength. Whereas a true Christian knows we're weak, but he's strong. Marble is a picture of pillars, but Babylon props itself up. The spices there is a picture of the incense, the wine, the atonement, the blood of Jesus. Babylon has its own wine. We can justify ourselves, the oil of the anointing. We just anoint ourselves. We've got our own magic powers and our own transcendental meditation where we can contact spirits. We don't need the Holy Spirit, the bread of fellowship. We don't need to go to church. We don't need to belong to church. We've got our own friends. The animals were a sign of accumulated blessing. Chariots, power, slaves, wealth. So all of these things, and I've summarized them there. There's a lot more detail. You could study them ad infinitum. But it's basically just to get us to see Babylon thinks it already has everything every Christian claims it has. So the church says, well, we have this. Babylon says, well, we've got all that. Yeah, but they're counterfeits. They're not the real thing. The real thing is only found in Jesus Christ. Okay, then, let's go to the final section then of Revelation 18. So Revelation chapter 18 and verse 21. And let's tie this up and pull this chapter 18 together. So then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea and said, with such violence the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. Let's read to the end of the chapter, to verse 24. The music of harpists and of musicians, pipers and trumpets will never be heard in you again. No worker of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine on you again. The voice of bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again. Your merchants were the world's important people. The billionaires, the financiers, they were the ones, the bankers who were considered the important people, not the holy people, the rich people. By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray. In her was found the blood of the prophets and of God's holy people. all who have been slaughtered in the earth. God holds Babylon accountable for everything that's ever happened from the beginning of civilization in Genesis chapter 11 to the end of Revelation. God judges Babylon for all of it. But in closing here, he uses something that's mentioned twice there. I don't know if you noticed it. He says it's destroyed with a millstone. Twice in that few verses we just read there, those 4 verses, millstone is mentioned twice. Why millstone? Millstone's only mentioned 12 times in the Bible, the word millstone. So if you take out the times it's repeated, there's only 6 or 7 times it's mentioned. Now here's a very interesting thing, one of those weird coincidences. Every time you find the word millstone mentioned, it's a symbol of something to do with the end time, the final judgment. So, you just put up this last chart, and we'll end tonight's study with this. Each time a millstone is mentioned in the Bible, it's as if God uses it as a prophetic symbol to remind us of the destruction that's coming. So we just read there in Revelation that the mighty angel throws a huge millstone at the destruction of Babylon. It's destroyed with this picture of a millstone being thrown into the sea, and Babylon is destroyed. So I'll not turn to the scriptures here. I'll trust that you already know them. So in Judges 9, there was a man who took over Gideon's rulership and killed all Gideon's sons, executed them all. He was a man called Abimelech, Abi, father, Melech, king. My father is king. And he was a picture of Antichrist. He's someone who seized power, killed all his opponents, and he took over Shechem. And he ended up killing all the people in Shechem, as was prophesied. And when he went to destroy the final stage, a woman dropped a millstone on his head and it cracked his skull and killed him. You know the story? Yeah, how does Antichrist die? By a fatal head wound. So we've got a picture of this Antichrist, Abimelech, being killed by a millstone from a head wound, which is the exact picture of what we get in Revelation of how Antichrist is killed and his kingdom is destroyed by a millstone. So God's using this picture of a millstone just to remind us, next time you read the Bible, when you read millstone, remember God's reminding you of the end times. Remember, everything in the Bible is prophecy. Everything. It's all a picture of the pattern of God's prophetic word that never ends. So in Isaiah, the millstone is, just as we've read, remember Isaiah is what Revelation's repeating. Babylon will be destroyed by a millstone. In Job, the great dragon, the great serpent, Leviathan is called, the serpent out of the sea. Remember there's 2 beasts, one out of the land, one out of the sea. The great beast, according to Egyptian understanding, out of the land was called Rahab. The great serpent out of the sea was called Leviathan, and Leviathan is described as having armor like a millstone, and it's the great dragon that's obviously going to be destroyed, this great serpent, at the end. So we've got another time there that the word millstone is used. Every time millstone occurs, every time it's a picture of something in the end times. Jeremiah describes Babylon being desolate, again links it to the millstone. And when he writes the book of Lamentations, where the people are taken into slavery into Babylon, again he uses the symbolism of a millstone, of people being taken and having to grind at a millstone, because that's what Babylon does. It has slaves, it doesn't have free people. And the last one, I think we'll just look at this, Matthew 18. Can we go there? Matthew 18 and verse 6. Matthew 18 and verse 6, Jesus himself used the imagery of the millstone to remind us what the world is really like. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned into the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to stumble. Such things must come. But woe, remember, woe, twice again, woe to that person through whom they come. Perhaps one of the biggest pictures of why God has to bring judgment in the end times is because of children. The world is going to so corrupt children. The world is going to so cause them to sin. In other words, bring them up with the belief that sin and iniquity is good. So, I mean, a child doesn't know. I don't think God judges the children, by the way. But God has to bring judgment. And that's why Jesus doesn't just say the world's going to be judged. It says you're going to be thrown into the sea with a millstone around your neck. Because that's what happens to Babylon at the end. The millstone is thrown into the sea. So Jesus is saying the judgment has to come, because otherwise you're going to destroy all the children. Never in the history of the world have we had a time in world history where children are just disposed of in the way they are now. Millions upon millions are burnt even before they get out of the womb. Never mind the corruption of children and the things they're being taught now. Jesus says the millstone's coming. Babylon is going to be destroyed. Woe to the world, Babylon, because of what this system does to humanity, but especially to children. And then he says something strange at the end. He says, never again, Babylon, will the voice of the bride and the bridegroom be heard in you. Never again will the sound of the harp and music be heard in you. And never again will the light of a lamp light upon you. Now, what's interesting about those three things? Those are the three things that God takes from earth to heaven. The lampstand, the musicians, the harpists, and the bride. So it's, in other words, God is saying to Babylon, the important things. Remember, the lampstand was on earth, but when John got into heaven, the lamp was in heaven. What was the lampstand? The church. Who was the bride? The church. Who's the light of the world? The church. Who are the harpists singing the redemption song of the Lamb? The church. So it's as if God is reminding us there at the end of Revelation chapter 18. He's saying, Babylon, these things I'm taking out before this comes. You won't hear these things. You won't hear the sound of the bride. You won't see the light of the lampstand. You won't hear the music of redemption. They're all in heaven now. But the millstone's coming, and you're going to be judged. So we need to get ready for what Jesus is going to do. The destruction of Babylon is certain. God is not going to change his mind. But the salvation of his church is even more certain. He's not going to change his mind about that either. His church is going to be rescued and taken to heaven. Amen.